By the time the FBI realized how much money the mafia truly controlled, it was already too late. The cash was gone, not burned, not buried, but laundered through Swiss accounts, Vatican ledgers, and European banks that never asked questions. The mafia didn't just build a criminal empire. It built a financial system, one that mirrored the legitimate economy so perfectly that for decades, the two were indistinguishable. Welcome to the Financial Historians, where money, power, and history collide, and nothing is ever as simple as it looks. The story begins in Sicily, a small island at the center of the Mediterranean, a crossroads of civilizations and a laboratory for survival. Greeks, Romans, Arabs, Normans, Spaniards, they all came, ruled, and left. But none built lasting institutions. Sicily was always governed from afar, never from within. Authority came in waves, but justice never did. When Italy unified in the 19th century, Sicily remained poor, fractured, and deeply mistrustful of authority. The new Italian state was distant, bureaucratic, and corrupt. Judges could be bribed. Police could be bought. The law existed, but not for everyone. And in that vacuum, something else took root. Not a government, but a network. A brotherhood that offered what the state could not: protection, enforcement, and silence. The first mafiosi weren't gangsters in the Hollywood sense. They were intermediaries. They managed disputes for landowners, protected citrus shipments, and collected debts in the absence of reliable courts. They ensured business flowed in a place where trust was rare and violence was cheap. But their protection came at a cost. A fee called pizzo. If you refused to pay, your oranges rotted, your livestock vanished, your family disappeared. Protection turned into extortion. Cooperation turned into obedience. The mafia evolved from a service into a system. By the late 1800s, it was no longer a handful of rural enforcers. It was a parallel government, a network of men of honor who controlled every aspect of Sicilian life. From the docks of Palermo to the hills of Corleone, every transaction carried a hidden tax. Every handshake had a price. The mafia didn't just steal, it managed. It mediated disputes, collected debts, influenced elections, and acted as the invisible hand of Sicilian commerce. Violence was its branding. Corruption was its business model. And as money flowed, the mafia learned to diversify. Citrus became cattle. Cattle became land. Land became smuggling. Each profit was reinvested, never idle. In time, they realized something fundamental. That power didn't just come from force, it came from capital. Then came Benito Mussolini. In the 1920s, the fascist dictator saw the mafia as an insult to his authority. To him, it was chaos. And chaos had no place in his vision of a centralized, obedient Italy. He sent Cesare Mori, the Iron Prefect, to crush them. Thousands were arrested, tortured, and exiled. Entire villages were purged. For a moment it worked. The mafia's influence crumbled, its leaders fled, its hierarchy shattered. But like any adaptable organism, it survived by retreating underground. It waited, quietly, patiently, for history to shift in its favor. That moment came 2 decades later. When the Second World War broke out, Sicily once again became a strategic prize. In 1943, the Allied invasion, Operation Husky, brought American forces to Sicilian shores. They needed local allies who understood the ports, the terrain, and the loyalties that governed them. And they found them. In the mafia. American military intelligence, desperate for cooperation, turned to figures like Salvatore "Lucky" Luciano, the New York crime boss with deep Sicilian roots. In return for his help securing the docks of New York from sabotage and smoothing the Allied landings in Sicily, Luciano's prison sentence was quietly reduced. With that deal, the mafia re-emerged from the shadows, not as fugitives, but as partners. After the liberation, billions in reconstruction money poured into Italy through the Marshall Plan. Roads, bridges, and housing projects transformed the island. But the mafia was always one step ahead. Politicians needed votes. Contractors needed protection. Banks needed intermediaries. The mafia became all three. The rural gangs of the past transformed into businessmen in fine suits. They built shell companies, won public tenders, and skimmed from every contract. They infiltrated city councils, ministries, and banks. The mafia had evolved, from gunmen to financiers. By the 1950s, Palermo's skyline was a forest of cranes. Concrete was the new gold. The mafia orchestrated what locals called Il Sacco di Palermo, the sack of Palermo. Entire neighborhoods were demolished under the guise of urban renewal. Mob-linked firms rebuilt them using cheap materials, public money, and political favors. The profits were staggering. But behind the construction boom, a deeper transformation was underway. The mafia was learning to think globally. In the shadows of Italy's post-war economic miracle, a second miracle unfolded. A shadow economy, invisible to tax collectors, but alive in every transaction. The mafia began to see itself not as a criminal gang, but as an institution. Its business wasn't violence anymore. It was liquidity. As globalization began to take shape, Sicily became more than an island. It became a hub. The heroin trade turned the mafia from a local power into a transatlantic empire. Morphine base from Turkey was refined in secret Sicilian laboratories, shipped through Marseille, and sold in the streets of New York. By the mid-1960s, nearly every gram of heroin consumed in America had passed, in some form, through Sicilian hands. The profits were unimaginable. Hundreds of millions of dollars, all in cash. But cash was heavy, traceable, and incriminating. The mafia needed to make it disappear. So they turned to a new form of power. Financial invisibility. Swiss banks, with their numbered accounts and sacred secrecy, became the first safe havens. Luxembourg followed. Then came Panama, Liechtenstein, the Bahamas. Entire microstates built on the promise of no questions asked. The mafia began to invest. Hotels in Palermo, vineyards in Tuscany, shipping companies and luxury real estate. Every purchase was a layer in a financial disguise. Money moved through anonymous trusts, offshore accounts, and shell corporations that no government could easily trace. It was no longer about hiding cash in mattresses or burying gold in fields. The new mafia understood something profound, that the truest power of money isn't in spending it. It's in hiding it. By the end of the 1960s, the line between criminal and capitalist had blurred beyond recognition. The mafia had built what governments could not, a seamless, borderless, and tax-free financial network. And it was only just beginning. By the early 1970s, the mafia had perfected its evolution. Violence was no longer its language, capital was. Money flowed through cities and nations like an invisible tide, washing away the stains of its origins. Sicilian families had become multinational syndicates, and their accountants knew more about global finance than most bankers. They were no longer just criminals. They were financiers of the underworld. The heroin trade had transformed the mafia into a global corporation. Its revenue surpassed that of entire industries. But every dollar earned needed to re-enter the legitimate economy. That meant mastering the art of laundering, a term that once meant cleaning clothes, now meaning cleansing cash. And to do that, the mafia needed allies in high places, not enforcers. Bankers. In Italy, one bank stood above all others. Banco Ambrosiano. Founded in Milan in the 1890s as a Catholic bank, its mission was to provide ethical finance guided by faith. But by the 1970s, it had become something else entirely. A web of offshore accounts, secret loans, and shell companies stretching from Panama to Luxembourg. At the center was a man named Roberto Calvi, chairman of Banco Ambrosiano, nicknamed God's Banker. Calvi was not a traditional banker. He was a fixer, brilliant, secretive, and deeply ambitious. He understood that money could be moved faster and quieter than ever before, and that secrecy was the ultimate asset. Calvi's most powerful ally was the Vatican Bank, officially known as the Institute for Religious Works. On paper, it was a spiritual institution. In reality, it was one of the most opaque financial entities on Earth. It operated inside Vatican City, a sovereign state immune from Italian law. Its ledgers were untouchable, its accounts untraceable. The Vatican Bank became the perfect laundromat. Under the guise of funding missionary work, charitable aid, and religious projects, it moved billions across borders. Nobody asked where the money came from, only that it arrived on time. Through a maze of offshore firms and coded transactions, Calvi funneled money for politicians, intelligence agencies, and, increasingly, the mafia. The Vatican, meanwhile, enjoyed the benefits of plausible deniability. By the late 1970s, Banco Ambrosiano was Italy's largest private bank. On paper, it was thriving. In truth, it was a house of cards. The offshore subsidiaries, in Panama, Nassau, and Luxembourg, were stuffed with loans that didn't exist and accounts that belonged to ghosts. And beneath it all was a growing pile of dirty money, from political kickbacks, arms deals, and the heroin trade. Calvi wasn't alone. Behind him loomed a network of secret societies, corrupt financiers, and shadow alliances that reached deep into Italy's political core. Among them was the infamous P2, Propaganda Due, a clandestine Masonic lodge that included generals, ministers, and industrialists. Their goal wasn't merely profit, it was power through secrecy. But every empire built on shadows eventually faces the light. In 1981, Italian investigators stumbled upon P2's membership lists during a corruption probe. The discovery rocked the nation. The names included the heads of military intelligence, senior politicians, bankers, and media moguls. Roberto Calvi was among them. That same year, the Bank of Italy accused him of illegal currency transfers and falsified accounts. Calvi was convicted, but the conviction was overturned on appeal. He returned to work, shaken but defiant. Then, in 1982, the illusion shattered. Banco Ambrosiano collapsed under $1.3 billion in missing funds. The offshore companies evaporated overnight. The Vatican Bank's fingerprints were everywhere. Calvi fled Italy in panic, carrying documents and cash. He traveled through Switzerland and Austria before arriving in London under a false name. He sought help from his old allies, but none came. Days later, on June 18, 1982, Calvi was found hanging beneath Blackfriars Bridge in London. His pockets were stuffed with bricks and thousands in cash. The coroner called it suicide. Almost no one believed that. The symbolism was too precise. Blackfriars, Fratineri, echoed the dark robes of the Masonic brotherhood he once served. The Mafia doesn't send subpoenas. It sends messages. Calvi's death exposed the unholy alliance between organized crime, politics, and religion. Banco Ambrosiano's collapse sent shockwaves through Europe's financial system. Yet the Vatican Bank survived. It quietly paid hundreds of millions in restitution, but never admitted wrongdoing. No one went to prison. The scandal revealed a chilling truth. The Mafia hadn't infiltrated the banking system. It had inspired it. As governments tightened regulations, the Mafia adapted again. Violence, once their most visible tool, became bad for business. Car bombings and assassinations drew attention, and attention meant risk. By the mid-1980s, a new generation of mobsters emerged, white-collar dons who preferred spreadsheets to shotguns. They moved into real estate, construction, and finance. Their goal wasn't domination through fear, but through ownership. The old code of omertà, silence, evolved into a financial principle. Secrecy was no longer enforced with threats, but with paperwork. Trust companies, offshore accounts, and nominee directors replaced the pistol and the promise. And the profits only grew. By the 1990s, Italy's Anti-Mafia Commission estimated that organized crime generated over $100 billion a year, roughly 7% of the country's GDP. It made the Mafia Italy's largest private enterprise, bigger than Fiat, bigger than any, and infinitely more efficient. Its money flowed through Switzerland, Luxembourg, and London, the new capitals of secrecy. Every crackdown only refined the system. New regulations inspired new loopholes. New laws created new markets. The Mafia learned to disguise ownership behind a dozen layers of shell corporations and offshore trusts, often controlled through proxies that existed only on paper. What began in the lemon groves of Sicily had become a global labyrinth. Even as the Italian state fought back with high-profile arrests and landmark trials, the financial roots remained untouched. Judges like Giovanni Falcone and Paolo Borsellino risked everything to expose the networks of corruption. They paid with their lives, assassinated by car bombs in 1992. Their deaths symbolized a grim truth. The Mafia no longer needed to rule through violence, but it would still kill to preserve its capital. As the 1990s unfolded, the Mafia diversified further. investing in legitimate enterprises, buying luxury properties, and even acquiring stakes in global corporations. The boundary between clean and criminal capital dissolved entirely. By the dawn of the new millennium, Italy's shadow economy had gone digital. The mafia used the same tools as Wall Street: derivatives, offshore accounts, and complex financial instruments designed to obscure ownership. The men who once ruled by blood now ruled by balance sheets. And it wasn't just Sicily anymore. The 'Ndrangheta of Calabria, the Camorra of Naples, and countless foreign cartels all followed the Sicilian blueprint. They discovered that in a globalized world, the easiest way to move drugs, arms, or influence was through money itself. By then, mafia wealth was so deeply woven into the global economy that economists struggled to measure where legitimate finance ended and organized crime began. The world had inherited the Mafia-AS architecture, a shadow financial system where the same tools used to hide criminal wealth were now used to avoid taxes, fund elections, and manipulate markets. The Mafia's greatest innovation wasn't the gun or the code of silence. It was the balance sheet, and as the century closed, the old dons were gone. Their heirs no longer wore leather jackets or carried revolvers. They wore Armani suits, carried briefcases, and sat on corporate boards. They didn't need to shoot anyone. They just needed to move money faster than the law could follow. The Mafia had become invisible. By the time the 21st century began, the Mafia had achieved something no government ever could: invisibility through integration. Its money no longer smelled of crime. It flowed alongside legitimate capital, indistinguishable from it. The world had changed, and the Mafia had changed with it. Violence was now inefficient. Secrecy was far more profitable. The old symbols of power, guns, fortresses, loyalty oaths, had been replaced by spreadsheets, offshore trusts, and corporate holdings. The dons no longer met in smoky back rooms. They met in boardrooms, surrounded by lawyers and consultants who understood the art of financial disguise. Money laundering had become the new battlefield. Instead of controlling neighborhoods, the Mafia now controlled liquidity, the flow of capital itself. The same techniques once used to hide drug profits were now standard practice in global finance: layered transactions, shell corporations, and nominee ownership. By the early 2000s, investigators began to realize the truth. The Mafia's methods had been adopted by everyone. Corporations, oligarchs, and even governments were using the same offshore systems that the Sicilian families pioneered. Dirty money and clean money moved through the same pipelines, washed by the same banks. The line between criminal enterprise and corporate strategy had all but vanished. In London, shell companies registered in anonymous office buildings bought mansions, hotels, and football clubs. In Switzerland, private bankers managed fortunes with no questions asked. In the Caribbean, offshore accounts turned tax evasion into an industry. When law enforcement traced funds, they didn't just find mobsters, they found politicians, CEOs, and ministers. The architecture of secrecy had become universal. The Mafia had taught the world a crucial lesson: that money doesn't care about morality. It only cares about movement. By the 2010s, global watchdogs estimated that up to 5% of the world's GDP, over $2 trillion, was laundered every year. Only a fraction was caught. The rest vanished into a digital sea of offshore transactions. The irony was almost poetic. The tools once invented by criminal accountants to hide heroin profits were now used by billion-dollar corporations to avoid taxes. Anonymous shell companies, bearer shares, layered transfers, once the vocabulary of organized crime, had become the language of modern capitalism. The Mafia hadn't corrupted the global financial system. It had predicted it. Look closely, and the parallels are everywhere. The Mafia extorted businesses through fear. Modern finance does it through debt. The Mafia controlled ports and supply chains. Corporations now do the same, just legally. The Mafia inflated real estate markets to launder cash. Global investors drive up property prices today for tax efficiency. The only difference is paperwork and the approval of the law. What began as a criminal network in 19th century Sicily had evolved into a philosophy of power, one that understood the truth behind every system. Legality is negotiable, but liquidity is not. Even the Vatican, scarred by decades of scandal, continued to struggle with transparency. In 2020, new reports revealed that hundreds of millions in church funds were still routed through offshore investments and luxury real estate deals. The ghosts of Banco Ambrosiano still lingered in the corridors of faith. Meanwhile, the mafia itself had become quieter, almost invisible. Gone were the bloody street wars of the 1980s. The real battles were now fought in contracts, not alleyways. The violence was financial, silent, complex, and untraceable. The true godfathers no longer carried guns. They carried portfolios. They didn't need to threaten anyone. They could simply buy them. What the mafia learned before anyone else was that power isn't about breaking the law. It's about bending it until it serves you. Through the 2000s and 2010s, anti-mafia prosecutors noticed a strange pattern. Each time they dismantled a network, the money reappeared somewhere else. In Dubai real estate, in Swiss accounts, or in the London Stock Exchange. Capital had become a shapeshifter. Every crackdown was a lesson. Every investigation made the system smarter. Even governments learned from the mafia. Tax havens became official policy tools. Financial secrecy was rebranded as privacy. Anonymous shell companies were marketed as asset protection. The very architecture designed to conceal criminal wealth became a pillar of global capitalism. The Sicilian Mafia had invented a prototype. The world simply copied it. Today, the legacy is everywhere. Every time a billionaire hides assets offshore, every time a politician routes campaign funds through a trust, every time a corporation shifts profits through tax havens, they rewalking in the mafia's footsteps. The structure is the same. Secrecy, intermediaries, and plausible deniability. Even digital currencies, celebrated for their innovation, carry the same DNA. Bitcoin's anonymity, blockchain obfuscation, decentralized exchanges, they all echo the same principle. Control the money, not the law. The mafia's shadow has become the world's reflection. In the modern era, the families of Sicily have largely abandoned the overt violence that once defined them. The killings that once made headlines are now rare. Instead, the mafia invests quietly. It buys hotels, vineyards, energy companies, logistics firms. It controls supply chains and finances local politicians. It no longer rules through terror. It rules through ownership. When police raids seize assets today, they don't find weapons and drugs. They find accounting records, real estate portfolios, and stock certificates. The battlefield is the balance sheet. And still, the fundamental truth remains. The mafia didn't destroy capitalism. It perfected it. It discovered that the surest way to protect criminal wealth was to make it indistinguishable from legitimate wealth. Once dirty money mixes with clean money, both become the same, currency without memory. That's the genius of the system. It doesn't rely on loyalty or fear anymore. It relies on liquidity. As long as the money moves, the power survives. Every anonymous account, every offshore trust, every private equity fund that shields its investors, they all descendants of that original Sicilian innovation, a network built not on laws, but on silence. The mafia taught the world that secrecy is a commodity, that trust can be weaponized, that transparency can be corrupted. It didn't invent greed, it standardized it, globalized it, made it respectable. And perhaps that's the final irony. The mafia's story was never just about crime, it was about capitalism itself, raw, efficient, and immoral. What began in the lemon groves of 19th century Sicily ended in the trading floors of the 21st century world. The mafia's greatest achievement wasn't wealth or power. It was creating a system so perfect that it no longer needed the mafia to survive. The shadow economy had become the real economy. The men who once called themselves men of honor are gone. But their legacy remains. In every untaxed fortune, every secret deal, every numbered account. They showed the world that money doesn't need morality to move. It only needs somewhere to go. And so, the circle closes. The mafia's story isn't buried in history books. It's alive. In the markets, in the banks, in the quiet flow of capital that shapes nations. It's not the story of criminals versus society. It's the story of how society learned to behave like criminals, elegantly, invisibly, and legally. The lesson is simple, and it's unsettling. Power doesn't require justice. It only requires structure. And the Mafia built one of the most efficient structures the world has ever seen. If this gave you a new perspective, hit subscribe. History has the answers. You just need to know where to look.